Welcome to the Gospel Addict Podcast. I'm Greg Bryan.
And I'm Jim Reski.
We're gospel addicts because we believe the gospel of Jesus isn't just good news, it's the best news ever.
We're addicted to the gospel because it doesn't just start us out in the Christian life, it is the Christian life.
Join us as we look at the Bible through the lens of the gospel.
Thanks so much for listening.
Ever get that feeling? Like you're stuck on repeat when you're trying to, actually improve yourself.
Yeah.
Well, we're really going deep on Tim Keller's ideas about repentance today. And trust me, this is not your grandma's guilt trip.
Okay.
We're talking about how Keller sees this whole thing as a force for actually changing your life for the better.
Interesting.
So, ready to rethink everything you thought about repentance?
Let's do it.
Okay, so I think a lot of people, when they hear the word repentance, they think about being punished for messing up.
Yeah, it's definitely got that connotation.
Right. But Keller has this whole different perspective. He talks about what he calls gospel-grounded repentance, which sounds kind of complicated.
It's kind of a mouthful.
Yeah.
But it's actually pretty simple when you break it down.
So less about what we did wrong and more about how we move on.
Exactly. It's not about wallowing in misery. It's about tapping into this idea of grace, this idea that, you're accepted and loved regardless of your flaws.
So instead of being stuck on our mistakes, we should be focusing on the fact that we can actually grow from them.
Right. And Keller actually uses this analogy of being handed a toolbox. Grace gives you all these resources that can help you actually become a better person.
I like that. So it's not just about feeling bad. It's about actually having the tools to do something about it.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's super interesting. But Keller also talks about how this religious idea of repentance, the kind most people know, can get kind of messed up, right?
Yeah, for sure.
He says it becomes selfish and self-righteous, even bitter.
Yeah, and it's interesting how often we fall into these traps.
So what happens when we get stuck in this religious repentance?
Well, we end up focusing on avoiding punishment. It's all about protecting ourselves instead of genuinely wanting to become better.
It's like we're more interested in seeming good than actually being good.
Exactly.
And then because we're so focused on being good, admitting our flaws is terrifying, so we just get bitter.
Because we've built our sense of worth on this idea of being good, so any flaw feels like a threat.
It's like we can't change because we're too scared to admit that we need to.
And that's the biggest tragedy is all. We miss out on the opportunity to actually grow.
Yeah, when we're so busy defending ourselves, we miss out on the chance to actually become better. Okay, so that all makes sense, but how do we actually break out of that cycle? That fear-driven thing. How do we actually get to a healthy place with repentance?
Well, Keller brings up this really interesting figure, George Whitefield. He was an 18th century preacher who was seriously intense about personal growth.
Oh, wow. 18th century. Okay.
Yeah. So Whitefield had this whole daily repentance routine, and Keller uses it to show what it looks like when, grace actually transforms your life.
Okay. Sounds pretty hardcore, especially for a guy known for fire and brimstone sermons.
Yeah. He was pretty intense. But the interesting thing is that Keller doesn't want us to see this routine as some kind of rigid checklist,
Oh, okay.
He uses it more like a framework, a way to highlight how our thinking changes when we approach repentance from this place of grace that we're talking about.
So less about checking boxes and more about an inner change.
Exactly. So the first thing in Whitefield's routine is this idea of deep humility. He thought that was the foundation for any real change.
Okay, so what does that even look like, deep humility?
Well, Keller says it's about owning up to our flaws, really acknowledging them without letting our pride make us defensive.
Okay, yeah.
Whitefield, he asked himself these super tough questions every day. Stuff like, have I looked down on anyone? Or have I been too sensitive to criticism?
Oh, wow. Those are cutting right to the chase.
Right. Have I felt snubbed? Have I felt ignored?
Yeah, those questions really make you face those little ego things we all have going on.
Yeah, and that's the point, right? It's about noticing when we care more about our image than about actually growing.
Right, because if you can't admit there's a problem, you're never going to do anything about it. So what's next?
The next element is burning love.
Burning love. Okay.
Yeah. And this one really shows how repentance, it affects how we treat other people.
It's not all just internal. It actually makes a difference.
Exactly. It's about more than just feeling bad. It's about actually changing how you act.
Okay, so how did Whitefield put this into practice?
Well, he would reflect on how he was treating people. He'd ask himself, have I been thinking bad things about anyone? Like, have I been unkind in my thoughts or even, what I say?
Mm-hmm.
Have I been making excuses for myself by, like, putting other people down in my head? Have I been impatient? Have I been irritable?
Wow, that kind of daily reflection could really change your perspective, huh? Instead of instantly getting defensive, you start to see, like, oh, these are my actions, and this is how they actually affect the people around me.
And that's huge.
Mm-hmm.
Because when we remember the grace we've been given, it actually allows us to show that same grace to others.
Oh, I see what you mean. So, like, that saying, hurt people, hurt people. If we want to get out of that cycle, we have to, like, offer grace instead of just continuing the hurt.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the third thing in Whitefield's routine, right?
Right. Wise courage. And this is where we actually start to, put action behind all that reflection.
And this is where it gets real, right? Like, thinking about our problems isn't enough. We actually have to do something.
Exactly. And that's where Whitefield's idea of wise courage comes in. It's about actually confronting those things we tend to avoid.
Yeah.
Like those tough conversations or those tasks that make us anxious.
It's about facing those fears head on.
Yeah. But it's not just about, like, blindly charging ahead either. The wise part of wise courage is super important.
Right, right.
Like Keller talks about how often we mistake just being busy with actually making progress.
Yeah.
We get caught up in all this frantic activity, and really we're just trying to avoid being uncomfortable.
We stay busy so we don't have to face the hard stuff.
Exactly. We tell ourselves that, like, checking things off our to-do list equals real growth. But actually, we might be avoiding the deeper work, the stuff that really matters.
So how do we get out of that busy trap and actually do something meaningful?
That's where the last part of Whitefield's routine comes in, and it's called godly motivations. Basically, it's about making sure that our actions are actually lining up with our values.
So making sure our why is just as strong as our what.
Exactly. And Keller, he gives us this great question to ask ourselves. Why am I doing what I'm doing? Is it for God's glory and to help other people? Or am I being driven by, fear?
Yeah.
By needing approval? By wanting to be comfortable and in control?
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. It's so easy to get caught up in those things, just wanting to look good and feel important.
It really is. And that's why this last element is so important. It reminds us that, like, real change, it doesn't come from ego or fear. It comes from connecting with something bigger than ourselves.
So, wow, we covered so much today. We started with this kind of negative idea of repentance, and now we've got this whole new perspective, one that's, like, actually really hopeful.
And it's that shift, right? From punishment to potential. That's what makes real growth possible. When we can approach repentance with honesty and humility and, a willingness to really look at ourselves, it's amazing what can happen.
It becomes this force for good in our lives and in our relationships.
Exactly.
It's a journey, for sure, not a quick fix. This whole deep dive, it's given me so much to think about.
Me too. And hopefully it's sparked something for you too, our listener. Like, what if you took just one thing from this routine, from Whitefield, and applied it to something you're struggling with right now? What would change for you?
Wow, what a powerful question, something to really sit with. So until next time, keep exploring, keep asking those tough questions, and as always, happy learning.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Gospel Addict Podcast. Feel free to contact us via email at gospeladdictpodcast@gmail.com.
Stay tuned for our next episode, and remember, on your worst days, you're never beyond the reach of God's grace, and on your best days, you're never beyond the need of God's grace.
See you next time.